Hi there, and welcome to Pod Rocket. I'm your host, Paul, and today we are very fortunate to have Siddharth Kshetrapal, who is the design systems engineer at GitHub. Welcome to the podcast, Sid.
Hey, thank you. Nice to be here.
So, you're a design systems engineer, and we're going to be touching upon your React Summit talk that's
hmm
coming up. What are you going to be getting into there? But before we get into the potatoes and gravy here. What is a design systems engineer for anybody listening that maybe doesn't spend a lot of time in the front end or wants to get into that? Is that like using component libraries and designing them, or is it designing the entire like repo structure? Like what level are we talking?
I think all of it. So it's a pretty broad term for engineers who work in design systems. And so I specifically focused on the component library side of it. But then we have other engineers that do some tooling, some token work, some specific implementation like Rails or React or CSS. So I'd say it's a broad term. Um, it's basically the folks who create artifacts of design systems.
Gotcha. And so would an artifact be something like it could be the components or it could be
hmm
the supporting infrastructure that lets you quickly iterate and develop on those components. It could be both ends of the stick because one of those is very creative, in your face front end. The other one is more like, I don't know, a dev experience engineer. You're like
Yeah,
almost SRE of the front end, I guess.
yeah, and I think like right now I'm kind of working on both in parallel, and it's fun to kind of have also like some I don't know some experience with the tooling aspect of it because there's a lot of things you can do in the back of the front end that informs what your more creative side will look like. So I don't know. It's fun. It's fun to have more breadth over it.
Would you say that a lot of companies that have a healthy front end that you
hmm
visit and it's pleasurable to use and such, is that type of end product usually a symptom of somebody doing work like you in the back end? Or, is it only for bigger groups and those types of settings?
That's interesting. I think I think the kind of work I'm doing right now with like a big design system team, you usually only see them in like companies with a lot of developers. So it's one way to go about it. But then I worked at smaller companies which also had like good amount of polish and not the same level of structure or people contributing to it. So I guess what it comes down to is you need the right people who care about things at the right spot. Like if you have people who really care about design and the tiny implementations making those decisions, then you'll get the right things. And when you have people who really care about infra doing that, you'll get that. It's when people mix and there's like big teams, that's when I feel like the quality kind of dips. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's just natural for human beings. So yeah, you're giving this React Summit talk. For anybody listening, it's going to be called Balancing Flexibility and Consistency in Component Libraries. Now, you're giving a talk, so you're automatically a pro at everything we're going to be discussing today to the max because you're giving a React Summit talk. It's pretty cool. Um, so one of the up the vein of thought of what you're going to be talking about, integrating APIs and component libraries. What's the difference between an API and a component library? Because realistically, component library is expressing itself through what we could refer to as an API. So, like, where do you draw that line of distinction, and what is this dance that we're kind of talking about with those two pieces interacting?
Right. So I guess like depending on what framework or what implementation we're talking about. In this case, because it is React Summit, the API of components is the props that you use. So with how do you compose them with children, or if you have some Boolean values, is label showing true, false, kind of that kind of stuff. That becomes the API of your components. And the dance here essentially is how how strictly controlled are those props, or how strictly controlled is that API? Because that controls how much you can, uh, how tightly we can control the design of it. So if you have a component, let me give an example that makes it easy. If you have a button component that has four variants, and then those fours are like your primary, destructive, secondary, something like the common ones. And then inside of it, if you want to put an icon, you either get an icon prop that is supported by the system, or you can't put it. Right. So that's one way of going about it. Like you can only put the icons we allow as builders of the button component, and they would look exactly like we want them to. That's the more strict API approach. The more flexible API approach is inside the button, the contents of the button. Um, we don't control it as creators of the button. You control it as the consumer of the button, and you can bring your own icon, make it whatever size you want, give it whatever color you want. So that's kind of the dance here, where how we want to be strict in the sense that there is a design system. So there's a brand. So every company kind of has this brand. We want it to look like it's a button interface of GitHub, but we don't really want to come in the way of people just trying to get their job and ship the product. So that's kind of the dance here.
So it's really like defining closely and intentionally what that exposed sort of like landscape about the variability of those users of the components of the system. That's the API that you're referring to that
Yeah.
you kind of need to think through as a design systems engineer.
Yep. Like in my talk, I talk about the spectrum of flexibility, where you can create something super tight or you could create something super flexible. And there are component libraries that exist in both ends of the spectrum. And you kind of have to find out for your company and your culture and the kind of things you're trying to build, where do you lie on this spectrum? And that is the amount of flexibility that you want to have. It's really hard, but it's kind of rewarding to do.
I mean, that's like this is becoming apparently as I'm talking to you, I'm seeing this is a people problem too. This is like understanding how are people going to interact with your thing, and the interesting thing about this, it's not like you're throwing up a React library that like millions of people will use. It's different company to company. You're with a different group of people every time, so your design approach has to be different for you to do the best job possible.
Yep, yep, totally. And that's where it becomes slightly more subjective because when I'm building a new component, I tend to look at other companies, like whatever open design systems I can find, and I tend to look at how they do solve this problem. And a lot of times, their solution might not work for you simply because you're working in a different culture. Like a team or a company where the design team has more control over what gets shipped and everything gets reviewed, like every pixel gets reviewed before it's shipped, that would have completely different API needs than a place which is more iterative and people can ship and iterate on it and eventually get to a correct spot. Because in those places, you don't really want to come in the way. And the last one is like pure open source, like something like Material UI or Chakra UI. They have no context of who is going to use their stuff. So they have to be the most flexible they can possibly be.
I mean that when you say reviewing every pixel, can you give me an example story about like what that culture was like and what you really mean with reviewing every pixel? Like what did that review process look like internally?
Yeah, so I think I'm not going to name them because it sounds negative, even though it's not. It worked really nicely for them. I used to work at a company where before something gets shipped to users, a designer would sit next to you, look at every page, and kind of just open Figma on one side and your web implementation on the other side, and just compare them. And every place it didn't match perfectly, they would ask for those changes. So there was like a back and forth between designers and developers before something got shipped. And in that case, the design system needs were very different because a bunch of times you would just have something like a if a component from the design system already has reviews on it, like a designer has approved it, has blessed it, then the developer can just use it and they know it's going to be fine because it's already approved. Um, and and especially in that case, the designers didn't want developers to have a lot of flexibility because they didn't want to change something that has already been blessed by them, because that opens the room for flexibility and then errors and then things going off brand. So that was a very strict kind of a pattern there.
They want it to be right all the time with
Hmm.
right because it has to follow what they're going for. So it also sounds like if you're designing in the smaller team where it's maybe not as I guess we could call it the pixel by pixel approach.
Hmm.
Your job as this design engineer is to offer speed, iterative speed, so more designs come out quickly, and a creative landscape where things can be done safely and within some boundaries, right within the system you're designing. And the other one, it sounds like you're more like working to make sure things are done correctly. They're released predictably. Bugs can be tracked, documented, and found quickly. So, which one of those like lives in the jobs that you've worked have you found more entertaining?
Ooh, that's interesting because I think they're both coming from a good place. But this the first one that you mentioned, which is you kind of optimize the speed, but also put in the right building blocks so that people can actually have the same results. I think, especially now at GitHub, it's so big that most of the time I have no idea what people are trying to build using the components that I've built. So I kind of just have to go with a level of like, here are all the right pieces for you to combine. And then I'm trusting people that they want to do the right thing and they'll combine it in the right ways. So, but that's also part of it is also like the culture at GitHub, which is like it's iterative and you have to kind of trust people that they will do the right thing. And if they don't, then they'll find out and they'll fix it. And there's like heaps of tests to take care of it. Um, but a lot of it comes down to just trusting other people to make the right decisions. So there's very
Gotcha.
few locks and stuff.
And you really enjoy that process of like just producing quickly, and because I know there are some engineers that love engineering, they love making
Hmm.
something as perfect as it can be and stuff. So you're more on the creative, like I really like to make things iterative and quick and with some guardrails. And I guess if you don't know the immediate customers of what you're designing, you're kind of put in the shoes of like a material UI core contributor.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
we're closer to that than to my previous job. But I think from an engineering standpoint, it's still fun because I don't know what people will try to build with it. Um, it's a hard thing to build. Like I'd say open source library is harder to build than one where you control all the aspects and constraints of it. So we do have some constraints in place, but a lot of times I'm kind of trying to push myself into building those UIs that people might build. So there's a lot of guesswork, but there's a lot of intuition to it. So I like that part of it. A lot of the code I'm writing now is it has to be perfect so that people can be imperfect or more creative with it.
Right.
Does
Gotcha.
that make any sense?
Yeah, I know. It does make sense. It just sounds like such a experience heavy field. Like you really need to understand human behaviors about how these things are used in the wild to really be put in the type of shoes that you're in.
To some extent, yeah. The good part is that these people also work in the same company. So if you're stuck, you can just like ask them and have a call and say, please explain what are you trying to do.
Right.
That helps.
So going, we're on the vein of talking about your experiences and opinions here. What's one of the situations you've seen where a design system was either implemented from scratch, you helped implement it, or like people started to really try to buckle down and use a design system component library, and it actually ended up hurting
Hmm.
speed and company time?
Yeah, I think this happens all the time. Like even so, at my previous job at Auth0, um, we started the design system from scratch, and 1 year in, I think half of the decisions that we've made, we regret making them. But that's kind of how most like component libraries or like design systems go, where you make some decisions with the knowledge you have at the time. And then as people use them, they start breaking your assumptions or they start extending the design system in ways you haven't thought of yet. But then all of those are inputs back to your design system. to improve it and try to cater to those cases as well. So it's kind of a constant thing where you make something you think it's good, you're proven wrong, and then you take that input and then you make something again, which now you think is good, only to be proven wrong again in the future. So I think I've already had that once at GitHub. I've been there 6 months, um, but I made something. I was really proud of it, and it worked really well for the use cases we supported. But then within a couple of months, people started bending and stretching its ways. That makes the API look wrong and made me realize that they're further on the flexible side than I had anticipated. So that's also a tricky thing to develop that muscle when you're new to the company. Like you basically don't know what the culture is like when you join.
What's an example, like just to dive into
Hmm.
specifics real quick,
Yeah.
of how somebody bend and stretched the component or API that
Hmm.
you originally designed into a place where it wasn't so good or it broke?
Okay, I have the perfect example, and this is in my talk as well, where we have a menu in which you can select labels and users. So think of like a pull request, and you want to assign a reviewer to it, so or a tag to it. So you go through a thing. It basically looks like a drop down, and you select something. Now we wanted this to be very strict in how it looks because there's a bunch of things. There's assignees, reviewers, milestones, tags, all of these things. And we want all of these menus to look very similar and have the same feel to them. So we created an API which was very strict. It had like an object shape to it. And then it passed all our internal tests of what it should do. But then when people started using it, they started bumping into things where it cannot have a checkbox because the way somebody was using it, you cannot have an input type checkbox. It had to be an SVG so that it's accessible. So then we had to kind of change it and we shipped it for everyone. It seemed to work out. But then somebody was like, a description, we want to add description underneath. Sometimes it can be one line, sometimes it can be multiple. And they were like, we didn't really anticipate this, so our design kind of breaks. So what we're going to do is give you like an escape hatch where you can say, here's the whole menu, but here's my render item function, which will everything else will work, but just the item you have full control over. And I think this is like people call this inversion of control. Then there was groups, and people wanted render group. So at some point of time, we basically had a shell of a component with three render X props on them, so you could customize the whole thing. Which doesn't sound bad, but then we kind of lost all control over it when it was fully custom. So then any consistency that we wanted, we didn't have control over it. And any accessibility features that we baked in, people kind of opted out of them by doing render item because suddenly anything that we baked in, you had to re-implement it in your custom implementation. So that was a sign that the API was completely wrong. And then we recently rebuilt it in a more composable fashion. And now we're back to a place where people have more flexibility, but they don't break or they don't eject out of features. So it's still accessible and works pretty well.
So, and you mentioned accessibility. So,
Hmm.
does the check can you go into a little bit of detail? I'm just curious, like
Hmm.
why the SVG and checkbox thing had a discrepancy there.
Right. So what we try to do is when you're importing a menu from the library, it should already have the right semantics. It should have role equals menu. The items in that should have role equals menu item. If it's selection, then it can't be menu item. It should be menu item radio. And all of these like super niche things about accessibility, most people don't know, and like most front end developers don't know. So it kind of and like we have the luxury that we have accessibility experts on the design system team as well. So anytime I don't know anything, I can collaborate with them and we bake that in the component. But there are rules around it which might not be so obvious. So uh, when you have a menu item, that is the focusable element inside your menu. If you put a input inside it, that's incorrect because then the screen reader doesn't really know, should I focus on the menu item? Is the menu item radio the check markable thing, or is input type checkbox the check markable thing? So it kind of creates these conflicting ideas. Um, so and initially we allowed people to put checkbox inside it, only to realize that that's not the right way to do it. And we have to implement it, a selection mechanism on our own. And that's when, for visual users, we use SVG that has a checkbox because you want to show that something's checked without using a checkbox input element.
Interesting. Devil's in the details. That's like
Yep, and this
that's
is
really
this
in
is why
there.
you can also see like how something like a render item really scares me because all of this detail gets lost.
Right. So when you're designing a component like a drop-down menu like this, and there's menu
Hmm.
items and such, is using things like a hard-coded marginal offset, for example, to give like a little bit of
Hmm.
white space. How often do you like hard code values versus like have them dynamically adjust to client dot get bounding rect and nudging things around by percents and stuff? Like I've always been curious from like,
Hmm.
you're the pros of the pro. Like how do you guys do it?
Oh,
Or how
so
do you think about
both
the problem?
in like inside the menu, there's margins that are using like the strict margins that you cannot override because we want to have a say on what the spacing looks like. But the actual position of the menu is like a whole. I don't know. I recently had to touch that file. It's like 100 line long logic,
Oh
which kind of like looks at where the button is and where to place the menu, and then if the menu is going out of bounds of your window, then it tries to adjust it. Uh, there's like preference on should it be left aligned or right aligned, and if the user wants it to be right aligned, but there's no space on the right, then it switches to the left. There's like a bunch of logic that is like
God.
I'd say like it's very hard to read, but luckily there are tests around it, so it's not that scary anymore.
I mean that's that type of interaction, some of the stuff that's always amazed me. When you go use a professionally designed website and
Hmm.
your brain, it knows where all the buttons are. It knows
Yeah.
what to expect. Like the menu's going to look like this, and but when you use it, it can be in
Hmm.
a bunch of different places. Like I'm a big Datadog user, right? And so there, I go into my
Hmm.
server view, and like all these crazy menus are like
Yep.
shrinking and contracting, and I'm like, this is a living, breathing document that's like growing at
Yep.
every millisecond. It's really wild to wrap your mind around how much diff and corner checking logic is really going on to make that sort of presentation possible.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. Datadog is a good example because it's very dense as an
Super
interface,
dense. Yeah,
and those are usually like the harder ones. Like with GitHub.com, it becomes very dense in some place. Like the pull request page is very dense. Um, and then when you're building something like a menu, you just have like you should look at like the kind of stories I have. There's like one story for each weird combination that it can come in, and you're just hoping that somebody doesn't find a case which you didn't think of, which they always do, of course.
of course. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm sure the amount of ways that somebody ends up implementing it. When you first got into this job, were you like
Hmm.
amazed at like how difficult it was to actually like estimate and think about that human behavior of what you were designing?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I came from a place where I was building components for like a single use case, where like building a product, you know, this component is only used in this one page, so you know everything about it. And just when you zoom out one level on top, where this component can be used anywhere in the product, the permutations are just like exponential. Like it's just blowing up so much that you can just try to do your best, and you can like I wouldn't say like stress test the thing. Like every time I'm building a new component now, I think I spend a day building the component and like 5, 6 days just like poking and trying to make it fail and trying to document it the right way. So there's a lot of time that goes like just making sure it's good.
I mean, documentation itself takes forever because
Hmm.
it's really difficult to write something for another human that's not working on what you're working on because you really need to like think about I'm in their shoes. Yeah, documentation takes a while. I can imagine when you're writing a whole API for thousands of components, it's a monster of a task. Um,
Yeah. The good part is that you only have to do it one component at a time.
right.
And I think what works for me is writing the documentation first because then I
Inter-
don't really know how will I implement it. I only know how somebody would want to use it. So I write the documentation from a point of view like this is how I would wish it works. And then I try to make that happen.
Gotcha. That almost reminds me of like test driven development. You
Yes.
define the API first and then
Mm-hmm.
you go implement it.
100%.
So when you're designing these components and you're cooking up this API, like you said, you're doing one component at a time. So like once you're 20 components in,
Mm-hmm.
how are you remaining consistent? How are you getting the same mojo going that you had on day one? Like, are you working with a team of Adobe Illustrator fanatics that are like, listen, this is our vision. This is how it's all going to work. And then you're like, okay, I can take this and implement it. Or are you really just driving that whole steam engine forward yourself?
So the team is big. There's like 20-ish people, maybe more now, that work on just the design system. And out of that, the five of us work on just the React component library. And then we're always collaborating with the designers, with the CSS folks, with the Ruby folks, because that's the other part which is hard. The API shouldn't just align in a single library; it should also align across implementations. And I wish there was like the spec was clear from the start, but a lot of time we're making up the spec as we go, which means that consistency is like we're always chasing it. It never feels like we can touch it, we can grasp it. It always feels like it's three steps ahead of us and we're chasing it. Um, but I think some things that we've started to do recently have helped where we've started writing patterns of API. And every time you see a case that you've already solved before, that one becomes easier. And that's also true for like using the component library because it makes it more predictable. You can kind of guess the API. So if you've used the button component and now you're in the menu component, each menu item uses a similar API to the button that you're already used to. So then you kind of start guessing, or you see a similar prop and you see that, okay, I used it this way, maybe it works the same way. So that's kind of the holy grail of it, where when you see a prop, you should be able to guess how to use it, and you try it and it works, and then you move on. Like if you never have to read the documentation, that's how we know we're doing a good job.
So what about like the actual look of what you're making and
Hmm.
behave, not just the API. Maybe you're like more settled in the React side and the API and how it like that is all put together. But in terms of the actual design vibe of what's going on, like let's say there's a
Yep.
team of 10 people and they're making a little product, a SaaS product, and they don't have a design engineer, but they want to design and they want to design consistently. What are your advice to them on how to follow suit with that desire?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think the philosophy or the ways you would go about it are similar, where you want to define rules for yourself. So we kind of did this at Code Sandbox. So before this, I used to work at Code Sandbox, very tiny team when I joined. Um, but we wanted to have the same benefits of having like a giant design system. So a bunch of work that I did initially there was just sit with the designers and kind of make these tiny building blocks where what does our text look like? Every time we want to show a text, what is the exact color? And then if it has to be subtle, what is the exact color of that? And then you kind of start baking these decisions in. So the next time you're creating anything which requires text, you're like, oh, I'm just going to pull in the text component there. And then we have like a Figma sheet which has all the variations. And you're always trying to sync the output from Figma into your components so that anytime you're designing something new, you're like, oh, this text needs to be a little subtle. So I'm going to use text with the override of subtle. And that would mean the same in design and code. So I think I mean, we've tried to do it with just two people working on this actively, and it got us a little far, not very far, I'd say. But I think that's the way to do it. Where you make some decisions and you start baking them in as variables so that you can reuse them instead of trying to do it over and over.
So you sit down with your team or your designer, you really
Hmm.
flesh out what the ground rules are, and then
Hmm.
you try to abstract those ground rules into variables that you can interchange in your code. So like realistically, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm picking up that I can go into Figma or wherever our components are later, tweak adjust or whatever, and it should all propagate downstream effectively. Um, to some,
Yes, either all automated or with some manual intervention. But
with
yes,
minimal
that's the
effort,
idea.
changing everything. Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I'm thinking in material UI, it's one of
Hmm.
the best things when like I used topography for everything.
Yes.
You use subtitle heading or whatever, and then you go to your theme.js and you change it, and it's awesome when everything just
Hmm.
works and it's there. That's a good feeling. So
Yep. Yep.
um, so what do you think about people who use pre-existing component libraries like the material UIs of the world? The on your page you have a React library that you were working on.
Hmm.
um, but like if you were making a website, would you immediately opt for one of those, or would you try to design from scratch and say, okay, like this is a whole new like little micro SaaS thing I'm
Yeah.
making, so it's going to be a new vibe, I'm going to start from scratch?
I think I rarely start completely from scratch. I always bring in something. Um, Kind of depends. So, for example, I almost never use something like Material UI because it has a lot of opinions that I would either have to override or I'd have to replace and build my own things. So a lot of times I end up picking something which is more unopinionated or more unstyled. So something like I was working on React UI, the one you referred to, which doesn't have a lot of opinions of its own. And then there's Stitches, which is like that, or it's not Stitches, it's called Radix UI, which is built on Stitches. And there's a few libraries like that which have very, very little design opinions. So I try to start there and then try to customize and put my own design opinions there. But that's me, right? This is what I enjoy. I like poking around the details. Um, if I had to build a product and get it out there for testing it with users and the design didn't matter as much, I'll pick something else. I'll pick somebody else's opinion, like Material UI or Chakra UI. So I don't think there's anything wrong with either approach. I think it goes to what skills do you already have the team and what's important at your stage right now.
But if you're consistently trying to override things in material UI, that's probably a telltale
Hmm.
that you should be using something different.
Yeah, yeah, true. If you already have design opinions that you want at this stage, then don't use something that already has
Right.
them, or customize it. Like Material UI has a pretty good customization layer. So
They
sit
do.
down, customize it, and then start using it.
There are some things in material UI though that are a huge pain in the ass to override. I have found in my experience, like there's some shadowing and mouse pointer either being
Mm,
ignored or stuff that's just like it's really annoying. You have to throw in a bunch of crazy, or in my opinion,
yeah.
not being
No,
a
no.
HTML person, it's the crazy CSS stuff with all the exclamation point important things everywhere
Mhm.
to actually get working what you want to work.
Yeah, no, you're right, totally. It's like the theming layer is always the easiest, but the moment you want to customize behaviors, then it's like a whole different kind of. I don't think we have a nice way of customizing behaviors where how should a cursor behave or which direction should the menu open from? Those kind
Right.
of details are very hard to do like from the outside or make them configurable.
Well,
I don't think we have a nice way of.
CSS does have some support for this, but it's not inherently
Hmm.
like object oriented paradigm. So it can be like
Hmm.
difficult to scope and subclass like things of behaviors and stuff, which would be cool to see. I'm sure there's something out there. Some like there's probably something that like lends itself to much heavier object oriented like CSS and um I don't know if you've ever used something like that.
I've I've seen some implementations of it, but what I've like walked away from them is like it's way too hard to customize them. Like
Yeah.
you have to know a lot to be able to get exactly what you're going for. And sometimes the time it takes to configure, you might as well build something of your own. So there's always that battle.
And then if you don't use a crazy object oriented library for CSS, somebody can then pick up your project in the future and have an easier time onboarding. So what's the point? I
Yep.
guess
Yep.
it's tech debt.
Yep.
Um, so one last thing I'd love to touch on. I watched one of your other podcasts, which was pretty entertaining for me. You had a great microphone. Your voice was coming through nice and crisp. It was great. But you were talking about animations, and I love animations. I think they really make a website pleasurable to use, and they get a. It's like a weirdly opinionated topic.
Mhm.
Animations. There are people who like love them and hate them and don't use them at all and use them way too much. So as a professional design systems engineer yourself, like what's your take on animations and how they're currently used today and how you use them?
Um, I think we grossly underuse them across the web. Like very rarely do I see a website that's using them tastefully. And I think that's the hard part with animations that or motion in general. That it's very easy to go from this is useful to give context to this is now just whimsical and it's trying to be funny. And there's like a I don't know. I'm sure there's like rules and people study animations and motion and there's constraints that you should learn. I don't know them. So I kind of just go by my taste of what looks good. And I imagine a lot of people also don't study the same things. So it's very hard for us to grasp what is good. I think this happens with design as well. Like a lot of developers are really good at building components, but they haven't studied design in the same way that designers would have. So they have a hard time struggling with what looks good and what doesn't. So when they design something, it doesn't come off as good, even though they're trying the same. I think motion and animations are like even further down that line where it can be
Gotcha.
really useful when done right, but it's rarely done right.
Do you think that there's like a tool out there, or like for design there's just salts rules, like is
Mhm.
there something similar for animation, whether it be a library or like a set of practices or paradigms that you've looked at that you've found helpful?
Yeah, personally for me, I've kind of really enjoyed physics-based, like spring-based animations. So, for example, Framer Motion or Remotion, there's a few of them. They all use spring-based animation, and that just like that structure of thinking about your animation and like how much weight should it be makes a lot more sense to me because then I can think of how far is something animating? Like if it's just a switch that goes on and off, the distance is very small. So the speed of it needs to be a little slow. Versus if there's an overlay that opens on the whole page, like a modal or something, that's a lot of pixels that are traveling. And if they travel at the same speed, it will look sluggish. So you want them to be faster. And just thinking of it in like weight of the component and how much speed it should travel and kind of makes it easier for me to make something that looks decent. Because I can't think in like seconds, how much seconds should it take or what's the Bezier curve? Like that doesn't make sense to me.
Right, and it's funny too because a Bezier, I mean, if we go back 10 years, if
Hmm.
I animated anything, you had to kind of get in with the Bezier curves, or 15
Yep.
years ago. You can still see them in the developer tools. You can look at the
Yep.
curves and how things are animated, but yeah, why touch that? So, you said, what were the two libraries you mentioned? Framer and
There's Springer
the
Motion
Framer Motion.
and the other one, I want to say it's just React Motion. Yeah.
And and are these libraries, do they have would like healthy APIs that you think help orient your thinking towards how to use animations effectively?
For me, yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
There was a bit of a learning curve because we don't interact with springs a lot. So we don't really
Right.
have a
And
sense of like how much weight or how much like friction is there in it. But
yeah,
once
that's a
you get past
complex
that,
thing.
it feels a lot more complex than. But you don't have to know all of it. I would say like you only need to know like 5% of the physics to kind of get into the zone of what is easy to manipulate and what will give you the direction that you want.
No Maxwell's
Um,
equations.
no Maxwell equations, thankfully. Been there, didn't like it. Uh, but yeah, I think there is a bit of a learning curve, but after that, it's a lot of fun.
Nice. So yeah, Framer Motion. I saw it on your other podcast and it looked really simple to use. I've
Hmm.
used GreenSock before, which is like super pleasing because some of their APIs are very rich. A little confusing. So that one just seems like way easier. I'm definitely gonna check that out. Damn, we're already at 40 minutes. That time flew by. So to close out, Sid, like, is there any resources that you'd want to throw? Like, what if you have a Twitter? What's your Twitter so our listeners can come listen to you and follow you anywhere else, or any shout outs you want to give?
Sure. My Twitter is Siddharth KP. You just have to find it in the description below because it's hard to spell.
Gotcha.
And I guess that's it. Check out Primer. That's the design system that I'm working on these days. It's all open source. There's a lot of it wouldn't make sense if you're not GitHub. But there's a lot of things that you can steal and copy and get inspired by.
What was the name of that again?
Primer. So that's primer.style is the website.
Primer.style. Great. Okay, Sid. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on and talking about I like the candy shop and what's all behind the engineering of it, of front end and the things powering our websites.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.